Hi everyone, and welcome to this live webinar organized by FERMA and ECIIA. My name is Stephen and I am the CEO of FERMA. I'm delighted to moderate this webinar together with Pascal van den Busch, ECIIA Secretary-General. So as you know, with all our webinars, you are always welcome to join the discussion by leaving your question in the chat box, which you can find on the bottom left of your menu. We will take them during the Q&A session, which will be right at the end of the presentations. We will also have some live polling questions, and those will pop up right on your screen. So today's topic is dedicated to the General Data Protection Regulation 2 years after implementation. Where do we stand? What consequences on businesses, but also on the functions of risk manager and internal auditor? And where are we going? This webinar is a follow-up to the one organized last year to discuss the results of a joint ECIIA and FERMA survey, which we conducted to assess the impact of the GDPR on corporate governance practices 1 year after implementation of the regulation. And as a reminder, the GDPR entered into force in May 2018. It establishes the first solid floor for comprehensive privacy protection in the EU. The new regulation creating, therefore, a single set of data protection rules all across Europe. Anyone who does business in Europe falls under the GDPR, as well as anyone who processes the data of European citizens. So for the past 2 years, organizations within and outside of Europe had to completely rethink how they dealt with data in an economy which is increasingly based on the processing of data, including personal data. Next slide, please. And you can see on this slide that it's clear that digital risk is of concern to companies. The FERMA European Risk Manager report of this year shows that cyber threats continues to be the most significant threats to businesses in the short, but also in the medium term. And data fraud or theft are among the top 5 risks identified by risk managers. But we can clearly see today with the crisis that the sudden and wide-scale transition to remote working has increased the cyber vulnerability of many businesses. So clearly the threats related to the expansion of data management and use is high. And as such, a considerable number of risk managers are helping the organization to manage risk exposure from new initiatives before adoption. We can see that these are 37% of them, but also those arising from emerging technologies used by their company for 39% of them. And this includes the privacy risk assessment. And Pascal, I do believe that you're observing exactly the similar trends among your membership.
Thank you, Tiffany. And exactly, we have on our side a release last week, our 5th edition of what we called Risk in Focus, where we have interviewed about 600 chief audit executives in different countries. This survey has been conducted by 10 members, and you can find on our website the complete study. But I think what is very interesting, and I can promise we haven't changed the figures, they are very similar to the one presented by Tiffany on the next slide, where you will see what is rated as the top 5 risks for the auditors, and the number 1 on the list is cybersecurity and data security. That has been listed by 79% of the participants as the number 1 top risk for the audit plan next year. But it's also interesting to share what are the 2 following ones. The second one is about regulatory changes and compliance. The chief audit believes that this is the second risk important for the audit plan next year. And the third one is about digitalization, new technology, and artificial intelligence. So I think we are aligned. This is the reason why we thought it would be very interesting to have a discussion after 2 years, especially after the year we all have had and will have, I think. and especially also in the context, which was also confirmed in our survey, of remote working, exchange of a lot of data, a lot of virtual information like the one we have for the moment, and also some evolution in terms of regulation outside Europe that are also of interest but will not be covered in the seminar today. So I'm very pleased to welcome now our speakers, and I would like first of all to thank you for your time and thank you for sharing your experience. So first of all, I would like to say a big thanks to Mr. Micol, who has listened to us when we were presenting our survey and who is now today with us to present the report that he has conducted with his team. And he will also share with us what will be the next step. So thank you, Mr. Micol. And maybe I should also mention your function. So you are the head of data protection unit at the DG Justice, as we say here in Brussels. Welcome also to Mr. Avot. So Jérôme is the Group Risk Officer and Data Protection. Very interesting, I think, for the discussion today at Faurecia. So we are in France for 2 seconds, and then we will go to Germany, and we welcome Ralph Herold, who is the Senior Vice President Corporate Audit of BASF. And Ralph has also a very strong experience about data protection. As you know, Germany was one of the countries ahead in this area before the European regulation, and himself is very interested in this topic. I'm sure I may say that, Ralph. So now let me give the floor to Olivier Micol. So Mr. Micol will share with us the key elements of the evaluation report after 1 year implementation that was published in June and that you can find on the website of the Commission, and you will have the link also in the slides that we will share with you after the webinar. He will also tell us what is the feedback that he is receiving, not just from us, but also from the different companies, the civil society, and other associations, like the one about the DPO. And finally, he will tell us about what is planned at the Commission level in terms of regulation in the coming months. So, Mr. Micol, again, thank you for being with us today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much to you. Thank you very much for this invitation to speak to the FERMA and ECIIA members. I would like to stress that it is very important for the Commission to interact with all stakeholders and business federations. So as you mentioned at the beginning, my unit is in charge of the implementation of the GDPR in Europe, and we have another department dealing with the international data flow, Brexit, etc. So I will focus now on the implementation in Europe. As you said, I mean, we issued 2 years after the start of the application of the GDPR a comprehensive evaluation of the situation. The first thing, and I think everybody here will agree, is that some years ago it was very difficult to raise the attention of the board of a company to data protection. And now it's very rare that in our contact with businesses, in fact, this issue is not brought to the higher level. And this is despite the fact that the rules have changed only moderately compared to what existed since '95, when we had the previous directive in place. In fact, we updated with the GDPR, but it created a kind of wake up, let's say, among all operators, maybe also because you have financial penalties now. It's always a good way to wake up people. But for many, I would say, operators, there was a lot of continuity. Of course, there are new elements. It's a regulation. It's directly applicable. It reduces the fragmentation. But the philosophy of the rules are quite the same as what we had before. I must say that since the regulation entered into application 2 years ago, I mean, in May 2018, we have not waited 2 years to do an evaluation. We had already a first evaluation last year. We have been in constant contact with the industry, with the civil society, with the data protection authority, with the national authorities to monitor how the GDPR was applied. And for this evaluation, indeed, we got a lot of input, and I think you can find all that on our website. Also from individual input from data protection authorities, but also from the council, so from the national authorities, and from the industry and civil societies through our GDPR multi-stakeholder group. And it reflects, of course, not all industry. We had to select a number of members, but you have a very, I would say, thick report from the industry and without filter, I would say. So they say what is good and what is bad. So what are the main conclusions? And I think it should be a relief from also looking at the previous slides, where there was one of the concern was change in regulations, etc. That one of the main conclusions of our report is that we do not think that it is appropriate to amend the GDPR now, although there were some voices in all directions pushing for strengthening or pushing for some relaxation of the rules. But we think that it would be premature. And what we need to do, and this is also something you mentioned in your slide, is working on the implementation and on the enforcement. And I think this is something that, especially among businesses, what is needed is stability as regards of the rules. There are 4 main findings that we identified. First of all, is that GDPR in a few years' time is one of the few EU legislation that citizens know about. They even know the acronyms, which is very rare for legislation cooked up in Brussels. And we have almost 70% of EU citizens who are aware of the GDPR. And very importantly, we have the same proportion who are aware that there is a national authority to which they can turn to. That is to say, the National Data Protection Authority. So it's quite an achievement that it reflects also the concerns, the increased concerns of citizens about the how their data are being processed. The second point is that we have now a new governance system in place. Before, we had data protection authorities with different powers, and some of them were only acting as advising companies or doing recommendation, etc. Now they are the enforcers. So it's not the Commission. A lot of people turn to the Commission or to Ministry of Justice or whatever at national level. The enforcer, they are the data protection authorities. They are fully independent, and we are monitoring this independence. And they have really to enforce, to advise, and to sanction if necessary. But it means also that they have among themselves in the European Data Protection Board, which is where they discuss at European level, they have to create a common European data protection culture. They have to harmonize also the way they think, the way they behave vis-à-vis companies. And in some federal member states, for instance, we have somebody from Germany, Mr. Herold there, between Länder in Germany, they have also to agree between themselves and enforce consistently. And what we see at regional level, at national level, is that this consistent implementation, I mean, this is something on which we still need to make progress. And there is a lot of work being done by data protection authorities, but of course you cannot create ex nihilo a complete European culture. And this is something where which is very important for the Commission. And we're also financially reach out to company, to citizens, etc. But this is something on which we need to make progress. Third, what is also important is a lot of companies, we have seen that, have used the GDPR as a way to distinguish themselves in competition, as a way to support their innovation. We see data management tools being developed. So there is, it creates, of course, as company will always say, regulation is a burden, but also it creates a number of opportunities and way to let's say, have a competitive advantage. And also what is the fourth point I would like to see is that the GDPR, being technologically neutral, has showed that this is sufficiently flexible to accommodate for the need. And we saw that, for instance, during the COVID-19 pandemic, where, you know, there was this tracing application developed. They are more or less successful depending on the member states, but it was possible to develop these tools in line with the GDPR. And we came as a commission very quickly with guidance to frame a bit the debate. The Data Protection Authority also came with guidelines, and it was possible to show the importance. And it has also, the debate in the member states on this tracing application showed also the importance of data protection, because for the acceptance of such apps, data protection aspect was very important. So where do we need, this was the overview, where do we need to make progress? I think, as I mentioned, the work of the data protection authorities, and they need the necessary resources, both human but also technical, with the development of artificial intelligence, data spaces, blockchain, etc. They need to have this expertise. We need more uniformity in the implementation of the rule in member states. It has been achieved to a great extent by the GDPR, being a regulation directly applicable. But there are some areas where, because of the negotiation, I mean, member states have a flexibility. For instance, the age of consent for children, for online services. This is something which is embedded in the GDPR. So there are different age of consent, but there are some areas where member states have deviated from the implementation of the GDPR, and we need to remedy that. As I said, a more European approach from National Data Protection Authority is very important. And what I would like to stress is that you mentioned artificial intelligence and new technology. In all the current reflection of the Commission on fostering artificial intelligence, on the so-called data strategy, where we have new data spaces in the health sector, in the financial sector, etc., the GDPR is considered as a stepping stone. It means that the approach followed in the GDPR will serve as a model for this approach to support a data economy. And of course, I can mention also in the end, as regards international dimension, there is this adequacy decision being currently negotiated with Japan, which has been negotiated with Japan, the one with Korea, etc. We have the recent judgment of the Court of Justice on the data flows to the US. Here we are drawing all the lessons from this judgment, discussing now with the US side, working on standard contractual clause for transfers. I mean, looking at whatever solution. I don't know if there will be question on that. It's not directly my field, but I guess it's important. And then, of course, in the Brexit context, there is a lot of companies asking us, but it will depend, of course, on the whole negotiation on the Brexit. Will there be or not an agreement? And the time is running short. But I will stop there because I think I covered my 10 minutes already. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Micol. So I've noted down very essential element and key messages for our community that you mentioned, is that definitely the Commission is not envisaging changing the regulation up till now. So I think it's also reassuring that there will be some kind of stability in terms of the rules that apply, that there is a need for more uniformity in terms of implementation and enforcement across the member state, which I think is also very welcome, especially for companies, you know, operating in different member states. And yeah, there are still outstanding issues that need to be discussed and to be tackled, and notably, and I think it's a point that we'll come back to on the international transfer of data, which is definitely one of the key issues. And when we were preparing for this webinar, Mr. Micol, you told us that you would be keen and interested in getting feedback on the enforcement of the regulation in the different countries, which is linked to the messages that you just conveyed. So we have a polling question, a third polling question for our audience, if we can show it. Yes, so how would you assess the level of divergence in the enforcement of GDPR regulation by the data protection authorities in the EU? Is it high, medium, or low? So you all have now a couple of seconds to respond to this question. Okay, so I think we can have a look at the results. Okay, so according to the audience, the level of divergence is medium. Mr. Micol, is it a surprise?
Well, I don't think it's a surprise, because of course, as a business, you're always, I think you focus a bit on the problems, which is perfectly normal. But I would say that the GDPR still, as a regulation, has taken away a lot of these divergences, but still it's more the interpretation of how it should be implemented. And one thing, for instance, I could say is that, for instance, for data breaches notification, we see, and you can find the figure in our report, you can see a very different approach between member states. And I don't know if it is linked to companies being more afraid and just to be on the safe side, notifying more, for instance, in Germany and in the Netherlands than in France or Spain. So, but it's very interesting. And for us, what would be also extremely useful if the feedback from companies on practical cases where they see these divergences of approach between DPAs, to have concrete examples. It would be extremely useful also.
Okay, and we have also, as a follow-up, another polling question, which is, how do you evaluate your interaction with the data protection authority in your country? Is it very good, good, bad, or very bad? Okay, we can see the results. For 72%, it's good. Well, for 20%, it's bad, and for 6%, it's very good, and very bad for 1%. So, a reaction, Mr. Micol, to these results?
I think it's reassuring, and I think that it shows a bit the effort of some data protection authorities who, as I said, in the past had less experience in reaching out to stakeholders. Some of them were very much involved, but some of them were more, let's say, on the advising function, but without very much engaging. So to have 78 positive or very positive opinion, I think it's quite, in fact, it's even better than I was expecting. So, but still, as a Commission, we are still pushing the data protection authorities to engage more and more with stakeholders, especially when they develop their guidelines, for instance, to have more feedback from the industry.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Micol, and we will now turn to Jérôme. So, Jérôme, you have the double hat of being a risk manager and a data protection officer for your company, Faurecia. So, what has been the implication of the GDPR regulation for your company and for you also as a risk manager and newly appointed then at that time DPO? If you could, you are on mute, Jérôme.
Sorry, it's better now. Thank you, Tiffen. So I'm going to first introduce a little bit my company, so Faurecia. So just to make it simple, so Faurecia is an automotive technology supplier. So we are providing parts for a car maker, OEM. We are really an international company, so we have more than 100,000 employees in 37 countries, so we work worldwide, and we have a turnover of around 18 billion euro. So if you translate in terms of financial penalty in case of non-compliance with GDPR, you take the 4% of that, so it's 600 million euros. It's starting to talk a little bit to our top management, so it's helping. I will come back on that. In terms of activities, so we have 4 main activities. One of them is related with clean mobilities, so exhaust pipe, but also new technologies like hydrogen tanks, for instance. We have also seating, so back seat, front seat in cars. We have interior systems, so all the plastic panels that you can find in the car, door panel, dashboard, and so on. And we have also one more recent activities, which is an electronic activity, so which is regrouping all the electronic system you can get in the car. For instance, the infotainment system that you're using to listen to the radio and to entertain yourself, which is also, by the way, a great tool that will catch personal data, such as a GPS location or whatever habits you might have. So that's also something I'm working on. That was it for a very short presentation of Faurecia. Next slide. I can, okay, good. So in terms of impact of the GDPR, there was actually, of course, quite a lot of impact. So I've been nominated just before the application of the regulation in May 2018. And clearly at that time, we had a lot of newspapers which were saying, yeah, GDPR will be a big mess and the company will go in bankrupt because of that. They were really afraid of the GDPR. And honestly, none of this happened, or almost, because what I believe, and it's something that is quite widely recognized when I discuss with my peers, that 2 years after this application, it has only benefits for companies in general. In our case, one of the big benefits that we had from this regulation is the fact that we finally did a fully comprehensive inventory of all our data processing. So all the applications that are managing data are now fully inventorized. Of course, we already had in the past some obligation from the French Data Protection Authority to have those kind of inventory. But let's say the incentives were not very high, so the job was done, but at the minimum. And now clearly we started from like 50 applications, and today we have 1,000 applications. We started from an Excel file, and now we have a dedicated application to manage that. So we really industrialize fully the process of understanding which kind of data we have. And also, of course, what is important to have the inventory is one point, but we also need to make sure that those data processing are compliant, or at least in the spirit of GDPR. So it's mainly discussing about security. We need to make sure that those data are only accessible to the relevant people. That's the famous need to know principle. And we need to make sure that those data are being retained only as long as necessary. And that's something which is easy, but in practical, we realized that almost none of the application had some data retention in place. And if it was the case, it was mainly relying on manual action. So we push hard to define those data retention, which was probably the most difficult aspect, and then to make sure that we implement technical measures to enforce those data retention. And that's also one key point I had in mind, which is the fact that now when we are starting a new application, a new product, we do that from the very beginning. We define the data retention policy, and then we put in place also the automatic process in order to purge, delete, or anonymize those data. Why? Because sometimes I'm being said, yeah, but we have a 2-year retention policy and we have only 3 months of data, so there's no need to rush on that. Yeah, but if you don't do it right now, you will never do it. Or probably you will have no time, no budget, or no one in front of you in 2 years to do that. So that's clearly something very important, data retention aspects. Next topic is clearly the fact that this incentive, so we are talking about financial penalty, but also reputation impact, also help to release budget and to make a lot of security related projects. And that was very efficient, and we put in place some projects faster than what we could have expected without this kind of regulation. One aspect also which is very important and that's really changed our mindset is the subcontractors. We used to have, of course, a lot of subcontractors in many topics, and now we are taking much more care regarding who we work with, who are our subcontractor. Of course, from a legal aspect, we have this famous data processing addendum in place, but also from a very practical standpoint, we are now being much more careful about, for instance, certification, but also audits, and we are doing those audits on a regular basis for the most critical subcontractor that we have, because we, of course, believe that the security is a full chain process. So even if we take care of our own security, we also need to take care and to choose the right contractor we work with. Next aspect is the new processes. So clearly, 2 years back, we had no idea how we would react in case of a data breach. So if something goes wrong, that all the personal data that we are managing being published on the internet, we would probably improvise. Now we have a full process which is in place, and we know exactly how to react, who to contact, what to do, and how to get in touch with our data protection authority, because that's part of the requirements. We also know how we will have to communicate to the concerned people if it's needed to do so, and so on. So we are ready in case something wrong happens, and we also now includes clearly in all our application what we call a privacy by design. So meaning we, from the very beginning, take into account the fact that privacy is a key aspect and security as well. And that's something which is being taken into account very early in the development phase of application, but also our product. As I mentioned previously, we have some electronic products that are managing some personal data. And last but not least, those data subject requests, so all the famous requests that you can get from the data subject. We were all very much concerned about the volume of this request, and we were all expecting that on May 25th, we will receive hundreds of those requests. Well, it did not happen, at least for us, and actually not for the most people that I know. So we had, of course, a few requests from employees, from customers, candidates, but not that much. And we had, of course, anticipated, and we are now able to reply manually and sometimes automatically to those requests. So we are being much more efficient because also we did all the previous work and we know where the data are being stored. And we are also working a lot in self-service mode, meaning that, for instance, our employees or candidates, they know exactly which kind of data we have about them because they have access to those data directly. They don't even need to make such kind of request. And last but not least, we have those training that we did. We train all our IT population, we train our HR population, and so on regarding data protection. And we believe it's really helped to put them in a more security-oriented mindset. And now they know that when they are dealing with personal data, that when they are exchanging Excel file with some personal data inside, they have to be very careful, that they have a responsibility on that. And it's really a continuous process, but we are quite happy with the result of all those formation. We did some live, like we are doing today. We did also some MOOC, massive online open courses, in order to make sure that they understand all the principle of the GDPR, even if it's not an easy topic to understand. So just as a very brief conclusion on this slide, clearly GDPR is a journey. It's not something you can reach, and when you cannot say, okay, I'm compliant, and I think no one can say today that they are fully compliant with GDPR, but it's really a spirit. And we internally, and I think it's the case of many companies in Europe, we are moving in the right direction. We fully understand the spirit of the GDPR, and it's clearly helping to reduce the risk and to improve the way those personal data protection, which concern all of us, are being protected. Next slide. So I'm here also because I'm both DPO and risk manager. Clearly, when you look at the GDPR regulation text, which is, by the way, a little bit hard to read at first, the word risk has been mentioned a lot of times, 78 times. So clearly, the risk management is one of the pillars. When you look, for instance, at one of the tools of the GDPR, which is the privacy impact assessment, the PIA. PIA is nothing more than a risk analysis, where you have to assess the risk of losing your data in a way or another. So that's why being risk manager and being DPO makes sense. It's fully compatible, even if being a DPO is not that easy. Being risk manager is not that easy also, by the way, but usually the DPO is what I would call a 5-leg ship, meaning you need to have a bit of legal knowledge, which was not my case, but I learned on that aspect. You need to have some information system security knowledge as well, which was more my background. You need to be able to discuss with people, communicate, train them. So it takes some time and some skills also. You need to also know people within the company. So you need to have a good internal network, because even if we might believe that people will come to you and ask questions, it's not always the case in the real life. So sometimes you have to go and see them when you heard about projects and say, oh yeah, I was going to contact you. Fine, but then it helps to have this internal network. And finally, you need to be able to assess the risk. And assessing the risk is key, because this is based on this assessment that you will be able to decide which action needs to be taken. When we discuss, for instance, about the data retention, the text say you should keep data no more than necessary. So at the end, it's up to you, to the business, to the risk manager, to decide how long do we need this data, and at which point of time is it more risky to keep those data. So that's something which is not easy, but that's very interesting, and that's clearly a good link with the risk manager and the DPO. So at the end, being both has quite a lot of benefits from my point of view. So first of all, the risk-oriented mindset is already inside the risk manager, so it's perfect for the DPO to benefit from this risk-oriented mindset. In terms of action or daily task, risk manager is usually more medium long-term action, where you have to think about upcoming risk and so on, and DPO is sometimes more a daily action, where you have to take some very short-term action. So it's a good mix on a daily basis to work on both of those topics. And then, of course, because data protection is one of my risks in my risk matrix, I'm my own risk owner on this topic. So I'm able, I think, without any segregation of duties, to assess this risk at the right place in the overall risk matrix. So at the end, yes, it's fully compatible to be both, but of course, not all DPO can be risk manager, and the opposite is true as well. So just a few words about the ongoing challenge. So I'll be quite fast on that, but one thing that I already mentioned is to ensure continuous GDPR compliance. So of course, we did this inventory. Of course, we did those changes in the application, but applications are living on a daily basis. There are new modifications, new changes, new reports, and so on. And you need to make sure that those changes that are being made are still compliant with the GDPR regulation. And this is not easy, because even if you have a good network of DPO in your company, that's not something you can do. So that's why, for instance, training is important, and having some relay internally who understand that when they will make a new report that will more or less manage some personal data, they will have to think about who will have access to this report, how long the data will be kept. Should we broadcast this report by email? Not a good idea. You should, but maybe not just a link to the report and not the report himself, and so on. So clearly, continuous GDPR compliance is one of my ongoing challenge. The second one is what I call the weakest link. In terms of security, weakest link is our main issue, because when we talk about data breach, it's just about 1 point, one place where your data will be stored that will be exposed. Typically, it's your test environment. We usually secure quite well the production environment with multi-factor authentication and so on, but sometimes the test environment are not that secure. They are fully accessible, that we give a sample or whatever full access right to the user, and most of the time the data that you have in those environments are almost as sensitive. So of course you can anonymize them, but it's not always the case. Also, your backup, sometimes the weakest link is the backups because they are being held somewhere unprotected and they can be stolen, for instance. And sometimes the weakest link is just a laptop of a subcontractor, which made your data migration a few weeks back, and he went to the restaurant and he's got his laptop stolen. And of course, the laptop was not encrypted. So that's clearly not easy, and it's making the job of DPO a bit paranoid sometimes. So sometimes DPO looks weird in organization, but with the COVID-19 crisis, I think work people are okay right now. And last but not least, but I will go too much into detail on that, this is the famous invalidation of the privacy shield, like Mr. Micol mentioned. So we have a lot of questions on that, and so far just a very few answers. But I'm pretty sure that in the coming weeks and months, we'll get some help from data protection authorities on that aspect. And last but not least, so this used to be also one big challenge for us. So how to manage COVID-19 crisis and GDPR. Clearly, one of the issue regarding this COVID-19 crisis is the fact that the health information. So typically, when you try to measure the temperature of an employee, it's classified as a special category of personal data, meaning by default, this kind of data processing is forbidden, not authorized. So we need to have a few things in place to make sure that we are being authorized, and on the other hand, as an employer, we have to protect the health and safety of employees. So we need to find a good balance between those two legal obligations, and that's something that was not very easy at first, but I will come back on that. We get some help on that, hopefully. So typically, doing this includes clearly defining which kind of data we want to collect, and we need to apply basic principles like data minimization. So we should only collect the really necessary data. So typically, collecting the temperature itself twice a day is really not a good idea. So we should, for instance, just collect the fact that the person has been checked and that's it, or maybe just not at all collecting any person data, which is even better. We should, for instance, make sure that the CCTV system that we have put in place are totally compliant. So we should not have CCTV system in place that are filming people on the full day, for instance, to make sure that they are whatever respecting social distance. We should have a lawful basis of processing. So, for instance, you could imagine that the consent would be a good idea, but when you talk about your own employees, you cannot rely on consent for performing a data processing. So it could be contract, it could be legitimate interest, but you have to ask yourself this question. You need to make sure that there is a privacy policy in place. So you need to make sure that your employees are being informed regarding what they will do and which kind of data will be held by themselves. And you should also make sure that all the security and confidentiality measures of those data are being taken. So typically, you should not have an Excel file fully accessible to everyone with this kind of data. And finally, you should make sure that all those questions are being fully documented. So this is the accountability principle, and that's something very key for the GDPR compliance. So finally, it has been a bit complicated at first because all people in Europe were asking themselves what they should do, how they should deal with this kind of balance of obligation. But hopefully, as Mr. Micol mentioned, we get a lot of help from the data protection authorities in various countries. I'm thinking about the CNIL in France, I'm thinking about the ICO in UK, and probably as well from the country that I don't manage the language. But it really helped. And finally, we've been able, we believe, to implement a good balance between those both obligations. Thank you.
Thank you, Jérôme. Thank you for this interesting experience. And what I would summarize is that for you, GDPR has been a positive experience. So that's good to hear, indeed. It helps your company, I would say, to be more professional, if I may just summarize very quickly what you mentioned. I think COVID-19 challenges are also interesting, I'm sure, for the participants. And by the way, for your information, we have about 286 people on the line, so that's a good audience. And I would like now to hear about you, Ralph. What is your GDPR spirit, to make a link with Jérôme? What is the spirit at BASF? And I know you have implemented a very interesting system in terms of DPO, not the same as Jérôme, so that's good for a debate, I hope, very quickly after that. So the floor is yours. What is your experience after 2 years?
Pascal, thanks a lot. I'd like to relate to this one, what Jérôme and Olivier have said, and basically can confirm this positive experience. But let me add a little bit from internal audit point of view to mirror. And for BASF, global company, 59 billion sales, acting globally, 117,000 employees, majority Europe, but quite some significant activities in Asia Pac and in the Americas, basically. So data privacy, data protection is one of the key things we have to do. We are a chemical company, we create chemistry. So we're not in the end user business, which means first sight, data privacy, data protection is not so much related to us because we produce physical stuff, we transport physical stuff. We don't collect data, we are not in the consumer business, end user and whatever. But nevertheless, it's a key element. And looking to Europe, a lot of people do not understand there are more than one goal with regards to the GDPR. The GDPR is about protecting of data privacy of natural people, natural person, but there is a clear message about the common market and freedom to do business and flow of information as a common market. And the real catch here is, from a business point of view, you have to balance out. So data protection is not the overarching theme, it depends on the circumstances. And really, there are a lot of stuff including data flow cross-company, cross-country, which many people do not really appreciate what it means for a common market doing business in this environment, Europe. Next slide, please. Very important to understand, what do we talk about? Do we talk about information protection, IT security? Do we talk about data privacy, data protection, which are used in the similar terms? And what kind of levels do we talk? First means states, nations to nations. This is data privacy shield. This is contracts between countries or international contracts, whatever. And this is about trust each other, no spy agreement, stuff like this. Companies can't influence, but that's a framework we are in. Framework, government, companies, respective country or Europe, which means the applicable framework a company can do business. The next point is an important one, government and the citizens. This is about really how to protect, and that's how data protection started, especially in Germany, about protecting the individual against the government, against the state. Yeah, and this we can see the boundaries are shifted gradually because of crisis, national security, or whatever. This is a very important topic, but not part of GDPR, by the way. This is excluded. Yeah. The next point is enterprise. This is antitrust, this is IP rights and stuff like this. Let's exclude. The real topic the company normally is facing is on contractual basis. It's customer, it's vendors, it's employees. That's the moment where the business happens, and that's where the EU framework, GDPR, generates the applicable framework for everybody who's doing business in this region. So, which means companies adhere to laws and regulations, which must be clear, and we can't solve the problems and the disputes and the trade war and whatever comes up, or shifting data to somewhere as a legal legitimate purpose or not. This is framework which needs to be settled, and we must trust this is reliable, predictable, and if you adhere to the rules, it's not sanctioned. Very important. Next slide, please. For BASF, basically, I have had the position as Data Protection Officer for BASF SE and as Head of Corporate Audit until May 2018. We used this game changer, I would call it, to split, because in the future, internal audit needs to audit the function of the data privacy protection officer. So, and we moved this from a company point of view, country point of view, to European level. So we mirrored the way the authorities working together. So basically we defined one main establishment, which happens to be BASF SE, and then we have a group of companies, and this is a kind of entity. And where the main establishment is located, this authority, which happens to be Rheinland-Palatinate, the Data Protection Authority, then is responsible to deal with BASF in Europe, which means our companies, first sight, are not obliged to have the definitions company by country and then somehow find a way. Whatever happens, we route via the main establishment and address one data protection authority, which then will align within the entire organization of the country data protection authorities. With this, we can minimize the discussions and the interpretations and get pretty fast one opinion on a specific topic. With this, our data design changed from company to Europe, and in essence, it's a global one, to be honest. The majority of the business is here. The data processing happens mainly in Europe, so we are more or less obliged to adhere to all such kind of rules. Impact for me personally was we have to split the functions, so we do not have these two roles in one. I need to audit data protection, data privacy as legal compliance, as I do with any other legal topic. And I do this in the design, implementation, and effectiveness. The usual plan, do, check, act approach to see where we are and where to go. First impact. Second impact, technologies come and go. Artificial intelligence, a lot of stuff coming, and the business getting global without boundaries. But in essence, what we see is fragmentation, separation. Countries take back their authority and close markets and avoid such kind of business models. So basically, whatever happens in the future, including the technology, depends how the legal framework, the governments agree to act and deal with each other. And with a nice wording, national security, you can do close to everything these days. So we have a few challenges, major impact for business, and we have to see how we handle this one. But for Europe, to have this same common market approach and the same conditions predictable, I think that's a great advantage, and we are a huge market, hundreds of million people can play a role in the world here. And this could be even a kind of branding, data protection by Europe, a kind of role model for other countries, as California does adapt, and some countries does adapt the same logic. So very positive things. The point finally is it must work. Data protection privacy is only a good one if it works in day-to-day operations. So whatever we're going to do, this is not theory. We must find ways to apply it in a pragmatic manner to protect what we like to protect. And companies can't find states, and we can't impose things. So we rely on the political European Union, for example, to make their appropriate framework and deal with other countries to find agreement.
Thank you.
Happy to answer any question.
Thank you very much, Ralph. And I think this was a very interesting also example of how you can implement this new regulation in an international group. I would like to start with one question that was actually already in the poll, and that's for you, Jérôme, and for you, Ralph. And it's about your own experience. And what could you say with some details about this enforcement of the regulation in the different countries, and maybe give one or two examples of issues that you have had because you have seen that this implementation was maybe not as harmonized as we would have expected. So I don't know who wants to start. Maybe show me with your hand, please.
Jérôme, you like to start?
Okay, Ralph, the floor is yours. I was sure you would.
Okay. Honestly, it was a pretty smooth implementation with its setup, and it's a journey, as Jérôme mentioned, learning by doing, but with a clear definition and who is responsible for what. And we have the processes in place in case a data breach, for example, we could align this one. We haven't expected, honestly, we have expected more of complaints, of requests by data subjects, which was a kind of limited experience. There have been a few, yes, but not to the extent as feared by a lot of people. And the penalties, we don't see this threat of the penalties. As long as you got a clear structure, you go your journey, you learn, you improve permanently, and keep the authorities in sync what's going on, what works in practical terms, and what is not working, and then sitting together and find a solution in the spirit of the regulation, how to get it done. With this approach, I think both parties learn, and we can really achieve something. So I do not see this impact in a theoretical way and just pushing forward penalties for the sake of whatever. I think it was a very constructive implementation up to now, and there's the data subjects behaving the same manner. So I don't see a big impact on this one, honestly. And it was not a smooth ride, don't get me wrong. It perceived a lot of bureaucracy and documentation you have to do, but in essence, it worked.
Thank you. Very positive message. What about you, Jérôme? What would you... We don't hear you. I'm sorry.
Quite a positive message as well. We have not faced any major issue linked to discrepancies between European countries because we were most of the time not concerned by those discrepancies. For instance, the age of legal consent, that's not something we have to deal with. So overall, what we apply is we try to put in place the stricter rule for all the countries. So meaning that we had put in place a policy, an intern policy, which was clearly based on GDPR. And also what is quite interesting is that we try to apply this policy as well in other countries. So for instance, North America and Asia. It's not always that easy because when you talk with China about GDPR, they tend to say that they are not in the scope. But still, we believe that the spirit of GDPR is fully applicable to those kind of region as well, and the product and the way we are managing personal data as well in those countries need to be replicated, and sometimes the product we develop in Japan, China, or even India will be in the European market. So that's why we need to be compliant as well. So to make it very short and simple, we really use the GDPR as a starting point, as a template, and we roll out the spirit everywhere in the world.
Thank you very much. And I know time is running, so before giving the floor to Tiffany to make some conclusion, I would like to ask one question to both of you, because we have the big advantage of having a risk manager, a DPO, and an internal auditor with us. And if you remember, in our survey, in our report, we were really pushing for a strong corporate governance model to make sure that the implementation of GDPR would be smooth. And both of you confirmed that you succeeded in your company. So first of all, congratulations. But in 2 words, what would be your recommendation for some companies that are maybe still struggling? So what is the recommendation that you would make in terms of governance and implementation of this regulation? Jérôme, maybe to start?
Maybe to start with just a few words. My opinion on that is that you need to have people close to the business that are able to act as relay. And that's what we put in place. For instance, we put those relay data protection coordinators within each countries, within each of our activities, and also within each of our special projects. So whenever we have a special project, we put in place a data protection coordinator. Of course, it's not a full-time job. It's probably just 5% of their activities, but it's very important because then they act as a safeguard whenever there is topic related with personal data. They're able to either react directly or get in touch with me at corporate level in order to get the right direction to move on. So yeah, in 2 words, close to the business.
Thank you. And you, Ralph, what would be your 2 words as a conclusion?
Business is about trust, and data privacy protection by design generates trust towards all business partners. This can be a competitive advantage if applied effectively. Effectively means it must work in practical terms. We have to take care of things we can take care. Anything else we have to address properly and need a proper framework, and it's doable.
Thank you. Tiffany, the floor is yours for the conclusion, please.
Very much to all our speakers for your very interesting intervention. So we can clearly see that the GDPR, has been a driver for a change of mentality. This is really in terms of the management and the use of data. I think this is something that we can really get out of this conversation. And there's still a lot of, I would say, enforcement issues to deal with, and probably also to reduce the type of administrative work, because we see that it's still quite heavy in terms of compliance. But we are going in the right direction, and I'm sure that the European Commission is in close contact with the DPA to ensure that there are improvements being made so that the GDPR becomes, a competitive advantage for all European companies. So thank you very much to all of you. We have still some questions which have been sent by the chat. If we will answer them in written. And you will receive the replay of this webcast and the slides that have been used within the next 24 hours. So thank you very much for joining us today, and keep tuned for the next webinars. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Take care. Thank you. Thank you to everyone.
Bye-bye.